Well, the treasure is Christ crucified and risen from the dead. The treasure is what Paul recognized 2,000 years ago. Still the same treasure. We carry it in these very flawed vessels of human beings and our institutions, but the treasure remains. And we stay in the church and we fight for the church because of the treasure. And we must never fall into the trap of saying, because the vessels are so fragile and so flawed, I'm leaving. No, you stay and you fight because of the treasure. It's a classic problem in the church, and I discussed it briefly in the book, going back to St. Augustine's time. So we're now the 4th century into the 5th century. And the so-called Donatist controversy. The Donatists were those who said priests and bishops who had abandoned the church during times of persecution, and then who had come back, they were unworthy. They were unworthy to distribute the sacraments. So the Donatists were kind of a purist movement that said corrupt clergy were not capable of administering the sacraments. The great Augustine got involved in this controversy, and thank God he did, because he resolved, no, it's not because of the virtue of the cleric, it's because of the grace of the sacrament that it has efficacy. And so even the most unworthy cleric can legitimately distribute and administer the sacraments. It's a very important principle, and thank God for it, because it sustained the church up and down the ages. Just think for a second, I mean, we're all sinners. All priests and bishops are sinners, to varying degrees, but still we're all sinners. If the principle were, I've got to be morally and spiritually pristine before I can confect the Eucharist and distribute it, well then the Eucharist wouldn't be confected and distributed. And so the sacraments are not compromised in their integrity by the moral turpitude of priests and bishops. Thank God. The most important reason to stay in the church and to fight for it is the Eucharist. The treasure that the church has is Christ crucified and risen from the dead. And that treasure is reflected, for example, in all the sacraments. It's reflected in the lives of the saints, reflected in the liturgy, etc. But the greatest gift that Christ gave us, the greatest gift he left us, is the Eucharist. So Thomas Aquinas says that the Virtus Christi, the power of Christ, is present in all the sacraments, but only in the Eucharist, he says, is ipse Christus, Christ himself present. There's no greater gift. There's no greater reason for staying in the church than the Eucharist. When people leave the church for another denomination or they wander away, that's always my first response is, but what about the Eucharist? That's the reason to stay and fight.